Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Healers of the World podcast. And today I have Elyse Welles with me, and she is a multicultural author and sacred poet. She is a native Greek priestess devoted to reviving the lost temple arts of the Mediterranean through her work with land spirits and the frame drum. Elyse is an initiated high priestess in the eclectic fairy tradition of witchcraft. This fairy system that she is initiated in is not focused on the heterosexual fertility systems and is distinct from other fairy paths that we may encounter online. And as you can imagine, I am so curious to bombard Elyse with all sorts of questions about this. She is actually the fifth generation initiated into this path in her lineage. But this is not all. Elyse holds a master's degree in spirituality and she co-hosts the Magic Kitchen podcast. And she is also the creator of Seeking Numina, which brings her clients to sacred sites and practices through online workshops and meditations, tours, and retreats. Now, I have to tell you, I'm quite besotted with this woman, even though I've never met her in person. The first time I noticed a post of Elyse on Instagram, I could just feel the genuine eldership and embodiment she holds. And for those that have listened in regularly, you know that this is something that I really have a very keen eye towards, something that I really am hoping to foster more understanding of through this podcast. So I am so thrilled to be spending some time with her today. Welcome, Elyse. It's so good to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Robyn, and for that beautiful introduction. That was so eloquent, and it always blows my mind how many things I do. I sound so elevated, but really the work is so, well, no pun intended, maybe some pun intended, very grounded work.
It really is. And that's why I am so excited to have you here today, because that's what struck me from everything that I've seen of yours is so genuine and so grounded. But I am so keen to find out, Elyse, how did your medicine find you? I mean, of course, this is a lineage that you were born into, but I would love to hear more about how the gods and the goddesses reached out to you and initiated you onto this.
I think I was very fortunate to grow up this way, but at the time it didn't always feel that way. But I grew up between Greece, near the Temple of Artemis. Our town is just called Artemis because we have the temple of Artemis Tauropolos, of the Taurus, of the bull. And then on the right side of us, more close to where we lived, was Vavrona, Artemis of Brauron, they say in English. And this is the temple of Iphigenia, the High Priestess. And of course, Artemis is the goddess of the wilds and the animals. And I also grew up when I was in the US. We were here for education as a lot of the year. We were in rural Pennsylvania, actually surrounded by the Amish. So we didn't have internet at the same pace that other people did. We just basically had nature to entertain us in both places that we lived. And because even at that time, Greece didn't have internet yet. We had internet cafes you could drive into the city for, but that was the only way to have internet. So we were very isolated in the right ways, I think. And so I never had to unlearn. I didn't have a lot of the programming that a lot of people have about imagination is silly, or the gods are false, or they're just stories. To me, Artemis was real because I could go to her temple and see her statues and spend time with her. I didn't need, there was no need for deconstruction later in life. And then on the other hand of it, with the land itself, my parents had a beautiful home in Pennsylvania. We had an amazing woods there with a creek. We had a little grove of fruit trees. We had a weeping willow. We had a cherry tree. So I got to know different spirits of place in those intimate ways. I would lay out in this glade of the woods and ask the birds for help with my math homework. Like, I spent all my time outside talking to the trees. There was one particular black walnut tree that I would go to when I was having a really hard time, and it would help me alchemize that. I would just cry against its bark, and I would feel so much better within a few minutes. And so I was doing a lot of these things very intuitively as a kid. And I was also very blessed to have a spirit guide since I was, as long as I can remember. I remember being in preschool and she's guiding me in different things. But at that time, until about age 11, I thought she was an imaginary friend. I didn't think of her as something different that other people didn't have. But then as I got to 11, 12 years old, I started telling her, I'm too old for an imaginary friend. You need to leave now. And she was like, well, it's not quite like that. And she actually led me to some books in the library that helped me understand that she was a spirit guide. So I've only been disconnected from her for 2 different year periods in my adulthood when I pushed away and really tried to, focus on reality. I'm using my air quotes there. And they were the darkest, hardest times of my life. The rest of my life has been just literally just following the guidance. And I started teaching, I finished my first initiation at 19. So by the time I was 26, I was being told I was ready to teach. And I still waited 3 more years to really start a lot of the bigger work that I do now. But I started small and I followed the guidance, but I used to get really kind of self-conscious about my age and worry that people wouldn't take me seriously. And it happens. Sometimes people don't take me as seriously, or people would, they would just judge me or think I'm jumping in over my head. But my guides kind of slapped me around a little bit about that. And they were like, you have done this in 1,000 lifetimes. If you wait until you're in your 50s or older, you wait till you're a crone every time, you're not doing the work you're here for. Why do you think we've been guiding you since you could walk?
Mm.
And so I really took that to heart. And then I was on a retreat, and one of the other women on retreat had this really clear channeled advice come through after a meditation. And she said, you need to not get in the way of the medicine you're here to deliver. And that was such a shift as well, to hear that through her and Isis, I think it was, who she had connected with in meditation, who had that message for me. So it's been a real journey, and I was very hesitant to work with deities in the beginning, but Inanna found me in a really hard time and gave me like an 8-point plan to get away from this guy I was seeing, and it worked. And I was scot-free and I was clear, and I realized this is something I'm dedicated to now as well. So I always think of my work as kind of this braid of as above, so below. And my below is this land spirit work and this revival of the earth temple. And some people ask me, like, do I mean only the element earth? No, it's all 4 elements, but in honor of and in dedication to the planet earth. And then I have this cosmic connection to the goddesses. I call them the goddesses of the red thread. Inanna all the way through to Freya, all the way through, Egypt, Isis and Hathor are a big part of this, Sekhmet, but also the Morrigan, like it's a very long lineage of what we call dark goddesses, but what we really mean are goddesses who bring light in times of darkness. So it's a very powerful, weaving of these two things that really make up the body of my work now, and the purpose I know I'm here to deliver on.
Well, I'm so impressed. When I listen to that story, your purpose, when one looks at it with retrospect, the purpose seems so clear right from the start in terms of the environment and, your imaginary friend. And truly, what a privilege. What a privilege to have had that access to the unseen all through your life and that level of guidance. And it really does show. Listening to your story, I remember Diana Artemis is, if you will, like the patron goddess that I work with. You can see her in a rendering behind me there. And I was really confused, when I first started along this path, because I had an experience. I was going through a really difficult time getting ready to leave a mystery school that I had been trained in, and it had become my whole life and my whole community and, the whole story. And one night I woke up in my sleep chanting Inanna, Inanna, Inanna. Like I woke up as I was chanting Inanna. And, this seems quite childlike now, but at the time I was like, but I thought that Diana or Artemis was the deity that I was working with, the goddess that I was working. That was the face of the goddess that I was working with. And it was such a beautiful opening to really start to look at the overlap between the goddess stories and the origin of the goddess, and how the different faces of the goddess has been brought through different cultures at different times. And
Yeah.
I would just love to hear how you've experienced that in your work, obviously working with a number of deities. Do you have a patron goddess? Is there a certain pantheon you work with? How does that all relate to you?
So it's very beautiful what you shared about the Inanna chanting, and something that happened to me as well when I was maybe 7 or 8. So I was raised Greek Orthodox, as all Greek people are. About 98% of Greece is Greek Orthodox. And we would go to church, and Orthodox church, for those who don't know, it's a lot of incense, a lot of sacred art. Iconography is actually based on priestess and priest culture. postures. So they have very specific reasons why each icon is painted the way they are, why their hands are the way they are, the size of the eyes and the nose all have spiritual significance. And Greek church is very boring and it's very long and you're standing the whole time. And I was actually kicked out of Sunday school in second grade because I just couldn't stop arguing about some of the points of sin and things like that. So I did the full church service with my parents while my brothers were down in Sunday school. And so we were in church and I would kind of zone out. Now I know I was meditating, but I would see it as I would pick an icon and I would just travel into it. And this one day in church, we were on the far left side of the church in this little, like, kind of forgotten nave. I don't know why we were there that day, but there were two icons for Mother Mary's parents, Joachim and Anna. And for some reason, their names started to become this chant and it became Inanna. It was Joachim Inanna, Inanna, Inanna. And I was internally chanting that all service. And I transported. I must have been, it was after second grade, but it was in elementary school. And I just remember all of a sudden church was over. So it's very interesting. I still wonder, like, what did she show me then? Because I think that was probably the first time she came to me. And it was a hindsight thing years later in working with her that I remembered that. But yeah, my work with the goddesses, it all began really like the first time I actually reached out to a god was Apollo in like fifth grade. I was reading my book on mythology, and there was a part about in ancient times, the Greeks would pray to their wall where they had an altar. And I said, well, I don't have an altar, but the sun is there and Apollo's the sun. So I'll pray to this wall. And he answered. And I had tried praying to other like Jesus and, and it was always kind of like I went straight to voicemail. Like it felt like I wasn't being received. And Apollo was there. And I was like, oh, this is amazing. Hello. All right. Thank you. And that was it. That was the entirety of the ritual. So, but then years later, I was just in Greece with Artemis. We would go to the Acropolis a lot as kids. If you're under 25 and you're an EU citizen, you can get into sacred sites for free. So that we would take advantage of that. But it wasn't until I had that really horrible boyfriend that Inanna, I just was like, I need help. I need help. I don't know who wants to help me with this, but I need divine guidance beyond what I'm clearly able to do myself. And my spirit guide was oddly like that you're on your own with this. Like not about like, the danger, but it was more like the solution's not going to be here. And then I learned why, because Inanna was going to come and guide me. And Inanna, for those who don't know, she is probably the oldest goddess that we have any clarity on. We might have names and ideas of other goddesses, but she has the first book ever written was written by her High Priestess at Enheduanna. And it was actually a collection of channeled poetry. So really the words of Inanna herself, warning against patriarchy, because Enheduanna, the High Priestess at for Inanna, her father was Sargon, and he was the first patriarchal colonizer. He built these huge city walls around and he said, you know what? I see those little villages out there with no walls. I think we can take them. And Enheduanna is hearing this, and so she goes to Inanna and says, what do we do? And Inanna was kind of a quiet deity before this time. She came and rose because of the need for the marginalized really to have a voice as patriarchy came. And there was this understanding, even in that poetry, when you read it, it feels very aware, like how we are aware of astrology cycles and we're aware of Earth's, within the wheel of the year, we see cycles. We know that things must come to an end and things must rise and things must fall. And Inanna seemed to have that awareness, but she knew that people would need guidance to survive it. And so she comes as this first goddess. And she was the first goddess I worked with. I wanted to work with Brigid. I wanted to work with Hestia, these loving hearth deities that, feel like the best mom on the TV sitcom. But I am a wartime priestess. At the end of the day, I like to be where I can be helpful. I like to go where I'm needed. And I go to the work that also needs the attention and the help. So the short answer is from that point on, the gods and goddesses emerged as the path emerged for me. So I started sacred travel. I started seeking Numina during/after COVID, depending, because Europe COVID went until 2022, but in the US it was about 2021 that it ended. So I started in early 2021 traveling sacred places really intentionally, like as a full-time job, really. And that was where they started giving me these teachings that as I deepen this work and I understand it more deeply, it really is the origin of the pre-matriarchal, or sorry, the matriarchal, tribal, pre-patriarchal Greece. So the people that lived in small communities with matriarchal structures, and a little bit more like we would think of the Norse, how they had like vulva or shamans that would, be part of the village in that way. That is actually more akin to what my ancestors were doing in Arcadia. That's where my family's from, the hills of Pan, or on the islands of the Minoans, like Santorini. We call it Thera in Greek, Delos. Even Mykonos had sacred work there with priestesses Naxos, and of course Crete. All of these places had these smaller communities that then they grew, of course, because they were prosperous and they were healthy, but they also really revered the earth itself. And Artemis is that goddess. She is very, very old. She's the only of the 12 Olympians to come from a pre-Hellenistic age. And so I struggle with that in the Greek community, like in those who work with the Greek pantheon. I would say that's my main pantheon now, because those are the spirits of place that I work with on the mainland of Greece. But a lot of people think of ancient Greece and they look at writings. And the reality is, Homer comes to us in 800 BC. We have Hellenistic age records, mostly in Athens, though. I think people forget that Greece is huge. Athens is a very small part. It's like if all we looked at was New York City when we're talking about the United States. And these writings come to us in the time of patriarchy. So anything written down is kind of already at the end of the times we're all trying to revive and get back to and feel the connection to. So I'm much more interested in the Bronze Age, which is 500 years before Homer, and back another 2000. So 3300 BC up to 1300 BC is kind of the accepted standard 2000 years of the Bronze Age in the Mediterranean. But then we had this very interesting thing happen. We had a dark age. So we know something went wrong. We know there was something covered up. And the more I sit with it, the more that's the side of it I think happened. I think patriarchy came in, salted the earth as we know they used to do, and removed record of the matriarchal times, and then have continued into, by the time we have Alexander the Great, we have Athens leading the ship and all of these city-states living very patriarchally. We actually, by the time ancient Greek evolves as a language in that time, there was not a word for woman. It was the same as the word for chattel. So it's a very different time. And when people talk about oh, the priestesses of Rome, it's like, no, I'll be honest with you. You don't want to be a priestess in Rome. You really don't. We have much more freedom today as priestesses to solo travel, to be in retreat with each other, to get tattoos of what we want and know that we can still shop at the grocery store and be safe. Like, that is not something our ancestors have had in a very long time. Very, very long.
So many points of interest in that. When you were explaining how Inanna came through to you at that time, and you were also talking about the records from her High Priestess of when she started sharing that poetry to warn those to come about patriarchy. I got this image of the goddess presence being very mothering. And the image that I received is the mother doesn't want to live our lives for us. She allows us a certain level of boundary, like the lioness with her cubs, to explore and learn. And it's only when she really is needed to come in and solidify that boundary that she does. And I just received that image very much of Inanna, both in the history that you relayed to us and your personal rendering of that. And it also just made me think too that in terms of initiation and the guidance we received, such as you saying that your personal spirit guide actually stepped back a bit. I really believe that there are gatekeepers that hold levels of our medicine. And they do that to keep us safe, so that our medicine doesn't overwhelm us, and that there are certain initiations that we need to move through successfully before those gatekeepers will actually allow us to access that medicine. And when you were telling that story of why your spirit guide stepped back, that's what I was actually hearing. Oh, there was a level of initiation that Elise needed to move through for the next level of medicine to drop. And those gatekeepers needed to see that she had the self-belief and the courage to do this. So that's what I heard by you sharing that story. I don't know how much you relate to that.
That is very That's very poignant for me at this moment as well, because I have had some very, thank you for sharing that. Thank you for sharing that. I've had some very clear guidance since I began this retreat season. When I do my retreats in Greece, it is a 2 to 3 month event. It's the majority of my year in this way, where I spend a month before the retreats laying the groundwork at all the sacred sites, doing grid working, leaving intentions. My goal by that point is to have sold all the retreats out so that I can know who's coming and the medicine that they'll need, and I can introduce the land to who they'll be and begin that process. And that's where I finalize certain things about the retreat. Even though I always have an idea of what's going to happen, it sometimes shifts even up to that last month before, of what places want to be added or taken away, or we do this at this one instead of this ritual. And then after the retreats, I spend another 2 to 3 weeks giving thanks at the lands to the land spirits at each of these sacred places, and also getting clarity on the following year so that I can announce them. And I always announce them around July and August. And then people are hopefully they fill up in time that I can, by April, be beginning these rituals for the retreats at the end of April and into May. So in this lead up this year, I started getting transmissions from Maya, who is the eldest of the Pleiades. And I know even a year ago, I would not have felt confident saying that. I would have felt like there was an arrogance to saying something like that. Like, oh, sure, one of the main Pleiades is talking to you, like it feels egotistical. And that's what the ancient Greeks really warn us about. Like in all the literature and in all of the art we have from before the literature, there is such a warning against hubris, against thinking that you matter more than the collective, that you are not one with the earth and those around you. And that is what causes the downfall of every society, every single one, every single time. It's like this horrible repeating prophecy for humanity. And so as a spiritual teacher, I'm so conscious of that, and I try so hard to not ever fall prey to it. And the Pleiades are for those who might not know, they are 7 sisters. They're one of the newest constellations in the sky. They're a star cluster in the sign of Taurus, which actually, as we're recording this, I believe Chiron is in Taurus for the first time in like 50 years. So for most people in their lifetime. And there's a lot, essentially these next 7 years while Chiron is in Taurus, we're really going to be having a lot of guidance to return to the earth. And I think it makes sense because planetarily, we are at a juxtaposition point where we have to do something about this earth. We have to take care of it. We have to take ownership over the actions of some of our species against it. And that awareness is so important. And it's going to lead to us essentially needing, more genuineness, more authenticity in the way that we show up in the world. So I think Maya came to me now because I have this knowledge, and also on the 9th of June. So again, pretty recently, we had Uranus, the shaker upper, in conjunction with the Pleiades, and Sedna, the fixed star of being misunderstood, essentially. So we really have these truths beginning to be revealed for those of us who've often felt misunderstood, or like we just can't really function in greater society. Well, we can, but it hurts, the masking and the exhaustion that creates. All of that is we're being given this chance to relieve that pressure by listening to the earth. And I always had a kind of, like when I heard Pleiadian things, sometimes I would hear it attached to some toxic narratives, some narratives of control, some narratives of hubris. And now I'm understanding much more deeply that the Pleiades are, first of all, sacred to almost every ancient civilization we know anything about, which is incredible because they're very far and hard to see. And they also, in Greece specifically, they were the mountain mothers of teaching humanity how to function. And I believe, I've been told by Maya is also the mother of Hermes, who is the god of knowledge. He's kind of relegated to like commerce by the Romans, but he is knowledge and transmission of knowledge. He's the winds themselves. He's change, transformation. A lot of times he's denoted a trickster, but that's because change can feel that way a little bit. He's a very joyful trickster in those ways. He's the trickster of helping you ride your bike by saying, I won't take my hands off, but he does. But he's also right there in case you fall. So Maya is this mother of this, of this knowledge that we could say, we have gained. We've gained a lot of knowledge in the past 2,000 years. Just the ability to communicate the way we do with our languages is incredible. The travel that we can do on airplanes, we really are in an incredible time. But she and her sisters, they had to leave Earth because we were going down a trajectory that if they stayed, we would have destroyed them. So it's very similar to the fairy realm and a lot of these things that I've been understanding about the fairy realm, that they also had to put up boundaries. Like their fourth dimension used to be something we'd slip in and out of just on a walk in the woods. Sometimes we still get that moment, but it was very common, very easy. There was no separation until we developed in a direction that they had to put up a barrier, so that we have to work a little harder to access those mysteries. So yeah, Maya is a guide now for the work, and I realized she always has been. She's been the progenitor of this work for a very long time. And Leto, the mother of Artemis and Apollo.
Yes.
In Turkey, it's modern day Turkey, but it's ancient Greece. And before that, it was two kingdoms, Caria and Lycia, or in English, I think they usually say Lycia. But this is the Anatolian coast, so the far eastern edge of Turkey, looking out at Greece and Cyprus. And they had these mother goddess cults that I went to go visit. I was going to trace the sacred way, all these oracle sites that were there for Apollo and other native deities that were then attributed to Apollo. And what I found instead was this deep mother goddess cult that I really see, like Kiveli as well is kind of the progenitor of this. I'm really understanding more and more. It's these ancient teachings of the mothers of earth, the mountains, the rivers, the reminders of oneness that as our consciousness began to develop, even 40,000 years ago, 60,000 years ago, when humans were starting to do cave art, that was already a divergence from nature, and these mountain mothers arose to guide us to say, keep growing, you're here to do that, but don't forget.
Mm.
And that's kind of been the work, I think, for all of us, is don't forget. Keep growing, but don't forget.
Oh, there's just so much that I want to comment on. I have recently written a book, and I've been looking a lot at unity consciousness and the trickery that is at play, duality as the vehicle actually to embodying unity consciousness. And in that, really leaning heavily on the Gnostic story of Sophia or Sophia, her fall to earth actually not being a fall, but an intentioned descent to expand the light, to expand consciousness. But this brings in the narrative of the archons, these forces that are imitative. They're like the doppelgangers. They can't actually incarnate into matter, therefore they can't receive the wisdom of Sophia. They can only misguide us and trick us. And obviously, there's this deep story of shame that comes with being a human being that robs us of this dignity of being a human being, whether it's global warming or it's, the religious stories. There's always this thing of like, humans are the virus, humans are the mistake, right? Anyway, where I'm going with this is it's taken me to a place where there's a very keen eye on the false light in the spiritual industry, and watching how, because you mentioned this hubris of the fact that there is this cul-de-sac where many well-intentioned seekers start to receive fame or external recognition, and it takes them off the path. And so I really cannot agree with you enough on that.
Discernment. I've noticed the same trend, and it's very interesting because actually tonight I have, so outside of my public work, I also run, as part of the tradition, I run a small coven for the eclectic fairy tradition. And in that coven, I actually have a lesson tonight on discernment, because it has become clear that there's a person somewhat tertiary to our work, but we're all aware of her, and we used to do a little bit of collaboration, who has gotten extremely toxic. Like we've gotten 13 unique private, didn't know each other, had submitted things sent to the temple saying, hey, this happened, hey, this happened. And then two of our members actually were with this person in sacred space, and it was very dangerous, the work they were doing and the kind of arrogance that they were posing. They were siphoning energy essentially from their people. And it was very interesting because one of these women had known her for 14 years, and she's watched her evolve into this. I also knew a priestess. I had worked with her actually to learn a lot of what it took to have an online class, and she had taught me a lot. And same, she just evolved into this hubristic, narcissistic place that it's like I didn't recognize her anymore. And I think that's happening a lot right now, as I think it's part of this Uranus disrupting and the Pleiades revealing deep truths. And I think it's going to take a while. These are astrological things happening so far away that they take a while to really land and cause change. I think it's going to be 3 to 7 years as Chiron leaves Taurus that we really get that solid grounding and refoundational connection to the earth back. But I think we're going to see that disrupting in the next few years. We're going to see those people falling off pedestals, and the elders who have always been here and the elders that are emerging are going to become a lot clearer. So, and that's part of AI as well, I think, is it is making it a lot easier for people to pretend they know things. But once you're in sacred space, once you're in a class, or once you're on a retreat, or once you're in conversation like this, non-scripted, no real editing or anything, like it's being recorded. I think that's where people's metal is really gonna be. And I think if anyone's like, well, how do I know if somebody used ChatGPT to write a course description and then I show up in the class and it's bad? Like, how do I know the difference? I always say, like, if this person won't set up a discovery call with you, or they don't send you voice notes, because it's, I can understand too, sometimes people don't want to get on a phone call, like even as a student. But I am I like, for my retreats, I have everybody do a call with me beforehand, because even if, unless they've been on retreat with me before and we already know each other, but if it's somebody I've never met before and they just message me on Instagram, I don't have a public sign up link for retreats. You can't just pay and join us, because the energetic container is really important. And I don't go about rejecting people a lot either. It's more just knowing, and they're all themed differently. And so maybe this one's better for you than that one. And you don't know that unless you talk to me. So there needs to be a return to the human, which is a return to the earth. And that is, I think, a big message of this time we're in as well.
Yeah. Return to the human, return to the earth, return to the body, which is the return to matter, which is the return to mother. It's return to wholeness. And look, the way I understand it is, when a seeker enters the path, there's a lot of potential, and that there are forces that are trying to divert too much awakening, because one or two awakenings is not going to change the field. But when we suddenly have too many people awakening at once, the field destabilizes. And I think that there are forces on the planet that don't want that. So what I am seeing is that the lure of the glamour of spirituality has become a false light trap to actually take well-intentioned seekers who are lacking discernment and actually divert them. There's trickery here, even for those that are themselves being tricked. But I've spoken about this before on previous episodes, so I won't go too much into it. But I really believe that the full potential of the human being is that of multidimensional travel. And again, when I speak about the gatekeepers, we're not going to be allowed to reach our multidimensional potential until we are embodied and discerned, because of the danger that we are to everything else in all those other dimensions, which brings me beautifully into the fairy, because I've got a few questions. I'm very excited to learn more about this. But so I'm so curious about the way that you describe the fairy tradition that you are initiated into. And the way that you describe it is that you work with agender nature spirits, and the systems that you work with are not focused on heterosexual fertility, and that in this way it's distinct from other fairy paths. So, Elise, I would love to hear more around why that is important to the tradition that you are in. But before we go there, I would love to ask you a simple, but I think hopefully quite a profound question. Who and what is the fae? What is your experience of the fairy? Who are the fairy?
Yes. Oh, I love this question. Fairies exist everywhere on planet Earth, and my belief about them is that they are distinct from land spirits. They're also distinct from trees or rocks or other natural figures in the landscape. They're distinct from rivers and water sources, but they inhabit them. So at the foundation, I talk about this in Sacred Wild as well. I think that glossary is one of the things I get comments on the most about the book, that they're helpful, that it's helpful. The foundation of everything is these land spirits. And I also liken them to serpent energy. I really do believe it's the same as the ley lines and the serpents that people are connecting to in that lineage. I think it is land spirits a lot of the time. I know there's serpents of other elements, but when we're really talking, like we're in a deep cave and we connect to that spirit of the cave, I think it's a land spirit. in my experience, it's always been a land spirit. I can't speak for every cave on the planet, but the caves I've met, that's what's going on there. And these land spirits are very, I guess the best way to say it is stable. They're so stable. And so that can be a bit unnerving for the human constitution because we expect emotion and they don't really have that. So they're very stoic and calm. And that is their gift to us. They can bring us to that same neutrality, but it is also, they don't have names. They don't have humanoid connection to us. Like I always say, a land spirit is not going to weigh in on the best divorce attorney to hire, but they are going to help you stay calm as you choose the best divorce attorney. But then on top of that, we have these extensions of the spirits of the land, and those are the fairies. And the fairies are mobile. They can dance and dart behind trees. They have this idea of being a trickster, but it's because they are so eternal. Both land spirits and fairies, they last forever. They cannot be killed, they cannot die, and they're dynamic because of that. You know, they live so long. I'm sure they're dynamic. There's definitely places where the land has been disrespected and people have lived out of harmony for so long that it's harder to connect to the fae, and the fae might have a bit more of a distrust of the person connecting, even if they're not personally at fault for anything. But for the most part, the reason I think fae are considered tricksters or even dangerous is because they're so lighthearted. They're so simplistic. I had this experience in Kriti. I was with a friend of mine and we were at this cliff and it was very gray rocks. And all of a sudden there's these little red jaspers on the ground. So we start picking them up and we get to the edge of the walk that we're at. It's like up against another cliff's edge that we can't continue. And we see this like natural bowl in the land. And it has a few of these red rocks in it. So we say, oh, this is where we put the red rocks. Like we're following the advice of the land at this point. And as we put these red rocks in, if I wasn't with another sister on this journey, I would almost feel silly sharing this story, but she and I both experienced this exactly the same way. These fairies came. It was windy. It was a cliff's edge in Greece. There tend to be windy. But all of a sudden, the wind was doing this visible spiraling. Like you could see it in your third eye. You would see these creatures in the wind. Like their dresses were the wind, kind of, but they were also very agender, which I'll talk more about that and what I mean by that as well. And they're jumping on and off the cliff and they're like, hi, hi, hi. Like they're just expressing this welcome to us. And they're like, look how fun this is. Join us. See, look, you jump and then you come back on. It's so cool. And we're like, we cannot play that game with you. We will die. We are humans. And they're like, well, that's your loss. And like they were so happy to see us and know we saw them, but we could not play this game with them. But if you're a 2-year-old, you don't know that. You might go do that. So I think that's where we get these stories of the fae being dangerous, is they are just playful and simple and they're so of the earth that they don't realize we aren't in the same way, like that we have physical limitations. So instead, we stayed on land and we drummed and we spent a great afternoon there, but we couldn't quite move forward with that. So I think that's a good estimation of what fairies are like, is they're very present and aware of everything around them, but they also don't, land spirits are this way too. They don't get as sad and somber as humans do, or as, really it's a human thing. I think the way we, like that same friend of mine on that same trip, she took me to this little cliff's edge that was getting developed for the first time ever in human history. It had never had a hotel or a home or a village on this cliff's edge. And they were building this concrete, he was like a billionaire guy, was building this like mansion on the edge of the cliff. And she was like, I'm just so sad for the land. I'm just so sad for the land because it's never had any humans on it. And now it's going to. And I said, so we did a connection to the land. And what the land came back with was, it's not a big deal. It's a stone house. It's going to be here for what, 50 years, 100 years? That means nothing to us. Time is so long for land. And what's going to happen at the end? It's going to fall back into the sea and just be back to being rock. It was just a limestone, concrete, and stone construction. It was so healing and humbling to realize that a lot of the things we fear and work up in our heads as humans, the land is like, it's all good. It's not a big deal. Mm. So that's a very long answer to how I view fairies. And then we have these elders in the land, which are the big spirits of place, like the mountains and the rivers, or the lakes, or the sea. And then you have the emissaries of the land, these creatures like the foxes that live there, the badgers, the birds, the vultures versus the eagles. And then the guardians are the access points most of us have more readily available to us. Some of us are lucky to have elders nearby, to live on a mountain, to go to a river's edge. But if we don't, guardians are usually who we're looking for to connect to land. So trees that have been there a long time, the oldest tree you can find, boulders, any sort of natural element, a long hedge, like the UK has these lovely hedges. Those are really great places to connect to the land. Mushrooms, because those mycelial networks are very, very deep. So there's a lot of lovely ways to access land spirits through these guardians.
That is possibly the most grounded response I've ever had to that exploration. And as someone who's worked extensively with the mushroom, you've also given me such insight into why I get the type of answers that I get from the mushrooms in terms of like locating this consciousness in a way that doesn't have the identity of the name or the emotional imprinting. It's just absolutely exquisite. And my whole body is reverberating in agreement with everything that you've shared, Elise. I really, really love that. And I feel that this is going to be so helpful to anyone listening to ground this connection, which is a dream. It's all I want. Okay, so now why is it important that this lineage doesn't focus on heterosexual fertility systems? What is it that is so significant about?
I'll say this too. All of these truths I've found are because they've been revealed to me by the land. So I try to come to everything with pure openness, complete active listening. And that's when I receive the deepest transmissions. And this agender connotation really came to me in that way. Like every time I was communing with land, especially in the beginning of my journey, I felt like I needed to steer the ship a little bit to, like, when we go into a meditation, we sometimes like a guided meditation versus just nothing, or we like to put on binaural beats. So some of the crutches, if you will, that I brought into land connection was the male female, like, oh, this is a bee pollinating, which is like the man and the woman in sacred union. Like I would look for analogies and metaphors like that. And the land gradually was like, no, that's not really what it is. And instead, the land has kind of expressed that while fertility in land is a given, it's a very important thing. Abundance is a given, and it's a natural state of existence. It is not in the patriarchally described terms of this is man, this is woman, this is hot, this is cold, this is anger, this is sadness. Like a lot of these polarities that we're taught, especially in the 90s and 80s and back, that was a very common thing to express, that things were gendered in these kind of dichotomous ways. Instead, everything is much more on a spectrum. And you have things that need to interact, like a yin yang situation, in order for fertility to happen. But there is also no gender expression in that. Like the things that we consider feminine, or like that doesn't translate into land. It doesn't translate into flowers. It doesn't translate into, so like even in our witchcraft tradition, we are Wiccan derivative. If you go back before we changed to the Faery Tradition in 1968, our initiators then were initiated in Wicca. And eventually you go back far enough and they were initiated by like Gardnerian Wiccans. And so we still have some holdovers, like things like as the blade is to the chalice, so is the god to the goddess. We still do say that in our ritual, but I also added to that, as is the rain on land. So the rain on land is we can look at metaphors and analogies for the man and the woman there, but it's also just, it is rain and it is land. And the other thing that's very different about actual spirits of place, like land spirits, is that they're all of it. They are not one gender or the other. I don't call them it, I call them they, because they're all the genders. They're every gender and no gender at all, because there's something that transcends the need for labels like that. So I find the path just very accessible for everybody and anybody because of that. And I think a lot of the labels that people are getting caught up in this time period, which is so funny coming out of the early 2000s, where we were like, do not label me, no labels for me. Now we're like, here are my 27 labels. And I think it's just the pendulum swinging to try and get us back to what we are meant to be, which is oneness, which is unity, which is all of the above and none of the above. And that's what the land spirits are, you know.
I'm so stunned by this. I'm just so thrilled. So this book that I have been working on and just completely immersed in it, it was actually during an Iboga journey last year where this download came through. I wasn't looking for it. I didn't understand, what its context was to my personal life, but it was because of what is being written around the hermaphrodite. And, I'd been doing so much work on the feminine the last couple of years. Everything had been about the sacred feminine and supporting my clients and myself to come into greater unity by walking the path of the feminine. And then I went into this journey and it was like, okay, no, the next gate was open and going, okay, but that was actually in preparation for this. And go and study the rebus. Go and look at the original definitions of wholeness and any godlike creature in any of our folklore stories and our religious myths. And there's always this hermaphrodite quality because ultimately unity comes from polarity synthesis. It comes from being able to hold everything without it fragmenting us. And the moment we start creating any kind of identity to anything, we become fragmented. So as long as we have identity to gender, identity to, any title, any kind of destination, we're actually not going to be able to hold the energy of unity because we are becoming fragmented by that. And, when I was talking earlier on about the initiatory process I'm in, of course, you yourself know as this amazing author that obviously everything we write is alchemical. So if there's anything, I mean, my experience is if I'm ever writing about anything I haven't embodied, well, lo and behold, guess what fire I'm walking into in the weeks and the months that follow that. Because I may have the intellectual understanding, but there's something that hasn't been embodied. So for me, writing has been completely wild because I've had to live everything that is coming to me to teach about. And so the way that you are describing the nature spirits and the elements of nature already holding this kind of unity, and that consciousness is not allowing itself to be fragmented by identity, even though it holds the whole spectrum of a thing, I'm just so thrilled to have heard it described in that way. So thank you so much. Personally, that's just so affirming to so much of what it is that I am being shown about where we are and one of the possible paths to our future in terms of how we actually heal the fragmentation on the planet. So, Elise, with the Earth Temple arts that you are pioneering, and I really do believe that there is a lot that you are pioneering as a native priestess to the land that you are working with. And just in terms of the level of embodiment that you are holding, and with this wonderful relationship that you have with the unseen forces, that our future shapes their future. The choices that humans make affect, even if there are boundaries, the future of these other elemental beings. With that in mind, what is the message that's coming through to you, or how do you understand these times that we are in? What do you see the choice as being, and really the framework of the story humans are facing now?
Reenchantment. I think the only way, my goal is for every person I encounter, whether it's in the line at the grocery store or on retreat in sacred space, every person I encounter, I want them to find oneness with Earth. But I don't think everybody can in this life. I mean, everybody listening here probably can, but we all have those people around us that we're like, oh, I hope you can get somewhere that your soul came in here to do. But I think re-enchantment is possible for everybody. Everybody, even the most narcissistic, hubristic, egotistical, focused on themselves person has had a beautiful moment, fishing with their dad, or, walking a river's edge at twilight, or something that gave them, maybe noticing a bee land on a flower. And I think that aesthetic is going to be the first thing that will bring people into re-enchantment with the world. I think that's our biggest imperative, is to get people to care, they have to care. And if we can get people to find the beauty, and even if it's through somewhat unhealthy means like nostalgia, because nostalgia was viewed as by the ancient Greeks as a disease, because it could cause you to live too much in the past and not move forward. And I do believe that. I think nostalgia can be very dangerous for certain people and at certain levels. But I think if we can tug on the heartstrings a little bit to get people to have true, real love, maybe that's a better word than reenchantment, but is to love nature again. I think all of our answers will be found. I really think that's the crux of it. Like spending time outside, spending time away from phones, away from, yeah, the mental sort of traps that these apps are designed to keep us in. It's very important to unplug and, plug back into the earth.
Mm. That's so beautiful. And I share that sentiment so deeply because how can we love something that we're not in relationship with? Right? It's healing has to be so relational to each other, to the earth, and to the mystery, to the unseen. Because
Yeah.
if
Yep.
we can't experience it, if we are disenchanted, which is just so
Mhm.
beautifully expressed by yourself, we turn away and then there's no responsibility. And the moment we come into relationship with anything, there is a level of responsibility that becomes apparent. So that's really quite exquisite. Thank you so much. And I am biting at the bit to read your book, The Sacred Wild, especially after chatting to you today. And I just want to mention that obviously all of your links will be below. So to those listening, I know you're going to want to go and stalk Elyse now and find out about all her amazing offerings and her books. I, for one, can't wait to go jump into the glossary, as you mentioned, of the sacred wild. But thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Robyn. This was beautiful, truly beautiful.